Well, welcome to this video conference hosted by the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, the U.S. election, a binational dialogue. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very thankful to Sarah Zebel and the other American Embassy staff and our Russian colleagues for helping to organize this event. I'm Professor Andrew Bennett of Georgetown University. I'm joined by some of our students here. Just to give you a little bit of my background as it relates to today's topics, I've been working on American foreign policy for more than 20 years. I have worked on several different presidential campaigns on foreign policy. Gary Hart in 1984, Governor Dukakis in 1988, Clinton in 1992. You'll notice they're all Democrats. You'll also notice most of them lost their election bids. And then I've been involved in different ways since then. I should note that I'm especially pleased today to have our colleagues at MGIMO on the other end. I came to Moscow many years ago and MGIMO was my host. At that time I also gave a talk at the USA and Canada Institute in 1992, and I predicted that Clinton would lose the election. So I hope I'm more accurate today in discussing the upcoming American election. I'm also pleased to have Tatiana Shakleina leading the discussion in Moscow. Tatiana, would you like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your research and your work?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, sir. I'm Tatiana Shakleina. I am the head of the Department of Applied Research on International Issues of this Moscow State International Relations University. And I worked for all my life in the Russian Academy of Sciences at the Institute of the USA and Canada Studies, so I'm a specialist in American studies, American foreign policy studies. And now I teach at this university, and we actually prepare young specialists in American studies to, so all these students our students, my students and students of my colleague, and they had the courses on the United States, Russian-American relations, and international politics. This is a little bit about my professional career. Okay, so maybe Andrew.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, so we have about an hour to discuss these issues related to our bilateral relations in the American presidential election. And I want to welcome also our online audience. They can submit questions online, and we'll have some time at the end of that hour for questions. Let me start it off with the first question, which I'll be moderating from my end. And that's the question of how Russians are looking at the American election. What are they thinking both about the entire process of the election and how it works? What do they find interesting or curious about that? And also what they think about the two different candidates. Could some of our Russian students or colleagues address that question?
So, who will start? Actually, there's a lot of talk in Russia about American relations and American elections, and so we are very much interested. So, what do you think? Did you manage to watch the news to follow the events during the election campaign? Who will start? Maybe you. Okay, great. I think so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Does anyone hear me on that end?
Yes.
Across the pond. Welcome. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, thanks for the question also. I've been following the electoral campaign since March, I think, which was the time when I was in the United States. And I think the biggest concern here on the Russian side is basically just as yours, who's going to be the next president, but for very different reasons. Well, you know that Mr. Romney has been very sort of dismissive even of Russia's interests, and there were a couple of quotations by Mr. Romney that sound a bit worrisome here to most Russians, frankly. So I think we're all interested in how that turns out. And second thing, it's a sort of an observation from my personal side, is that the issues of values have become so important during this very campaign. There's been a lot of stuff going about the abortion. There's talk about same-sex marriage and that sort of stuff, which at some point, I think in April or May, they look to be in the center of the political debate. So I think that's a couple of observations on my side, but many of my colleagues are waiting, I think, to express their opinion.
And maybe you will just name yourself, your name and class, the year, just maybe, please. So, anybody else to continue, or no comment on the interest to the elections?
May I try?
Louder.
Good afternoon, or maybe good morning where you are. My name is Lydia, and thank you for starting the discussion. You've been asking what's the most interesting thing for the Russians, and if we take ordinary Russians, I think it's the system itself. Because Electoral College is what we don't have, and probably most Russians just don't really understand, and that state-by-state race. So every time the U.S. has elections, we are all curious about that. Of course, in this university we study that subject and know it better than ordinary Russians, but still probably that's what's curious about the whole process. And of course we are worried about who will be the next president, and probably my colleague was right that Obama is perceived more friendly towards Russia, but yes, probably that's the right word. So that's what I feel. Thank you.
Anybody? Any
Let me ask, if I could ask, where do most of you, or where do most ordinary Russians get their information on the election? Is it from Russian media sources, or do you go straight to the websites of, and if you go to websites in the United States, which ones do people use the most?
Well, if I may say, the elections in your country are not very much covered in Russian media, and we have to actually draw our attention to CNN, to Economist, to the sites which publish the information in English. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other?
Let me ask, does anybody read Nate Silver's blog? Or go to Real Clear Politics? These are two websites that I find a lot of information on.
No.
Yeah. If you go, Nate Silver now he's with the New York Times. He started he was an expert on baseball and statistics, and then he got interested in politics. The last election, he predicted 49 out of the 50 states correctly on the presidential election, and he predicted all 35 Senate races correctly. So he's got a strong reputation. But if you go to look at his blog, I think it's one of the most sophisticated discussions of the polling data and the polling questions. It's Nate Silver, silver like the metal, Silver. And Real Clear Politics is an aggregator website that has lots of stories from many different newspapers, but they also have an electoral college map that shows all the states, how many electoral votes, what the polls are in those states. So it also has very up-to-date information. So those are two good sources, I think, that especially Russian experts like yourselves should be aware of if they're following the election.
Andrew, could you please...
Now, Tatiana...
could you please repeat the blogs, maybe for us to put down?
Yes.
You put it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much.
You got it? Okay.
And
so, Tatiana, you and your students had some questions about the Electoral College?
you see, as you see, we, though we study the American election system, still we have questions, and we compare the Russian electoral system and American, and we wonder why don't you have direct elections and why you don't have popular votes. So while we have this different kind of voting in Russia, so maybe you can comment on why did it happen this way, and whether you have special views as comparing to what Russia does have nowadays.
Yes. Maybe some of our American students could say something about the Electoral College, if you know a little bit about it. Or does it seem strange to you, this system also?
Yeah, I think a lot of people here also find it a bit strange. I know that a lot of people would like to have just popular vote. I think the intention behind it is for smaller states to have greater representation within our system, though there's still the debate going on if that should override the fact that popular vote could mean that someone could win by popular vote, but ultimately not become president, which a lot of people disagree with.
Of course, that happened in the year 2000. Gore won the popular vote, but lost in the Electoral College. Most people think that's very unlikely this time, but it could happen. It has happened a few times in American history. If you go back to see the history of the Electoral College, it was created with the creation of the Constitution, and as Alexis said, it was to give the smaller states some more representation, but also it was confronting the problem of slavery, because the question was, how would you count the population of slaves? There was a decision we call the 3/5 compromise, that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. It's one of the many terrible things in American history of slavery. And so at that time, it was controversial how to count the number of slaves, and they decided they didn't want to open up that question again. They wanted to keep the 3/5 compromise, and they wanted to have the Electoral College instead of direct election by the Congress. That was the alternative that was considered, and that was thought that would give too much authority to the Congress, and the president would be too dependent on the Congress. So once it was created that way, it's very difficult to change that system even 200 years later. I should say there is one effort going on to change this system, and that is a number of individual states have had referenda where they have voted that they will give their Electoral College votes to whoever wins the popular vote. So if enough states agree to that, that would be 270 electoral votes, then effectively it would go around the Electoral College and it would make sure that the popular vote winner would always win the election. So far, states with 130 electoral votes have agreed to this system, that they would give all their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. But we would have to have about double that number of states to do that, and then that effectively would ensure that the popular vote winner would always win the presidency. So this is a creative attempt to sort of get around the Constitution.
I see. Do you have any questions about that? The Russians? Yeah, okay.
So for me, the most peculiar thing about the Electoral College is that it seems to be inherently undemocratic in terms of the fact that those states that are predominantly pro-Republican or pro-democratic, in these states, each candidate wins the majority of votes due to the winner-take-all principle, respectively. That's why we can just anticipate the distribution of primaries due to this process. And one more peculiar thing is the fact that is about primaries. So they start in one state, and then they just move till June. So the states that are the first to hold primaries, there is tendency just to put the logic of further elections, of votes, of the just distribution of votes. That's quite interesting, and it shows how your system works.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
No,
So let me just say on the issue of primaries, it is very unusual. So we have very small states that are the first primaries that have a big influence on selecting the candidates. Iowa always goes first, and then New Hampshire is one of our smallest states in terms of population. And then there are some others. And also there's been a sort of an arms race. They're always moving more early to have more influence. And so the campaign has gotten very long here. It's more, it's going on for, well, it even goes before the primary, so more than a year. So it is very unusual in that way. The advantage of that system is, since they're small states, the voters get a very close look at the candidates, and they take their role very seriously. The disadvantage, of course, is that those states are not necessarily representative of the entire country. They're not as racially diverse as the country. They're not as urban as most of the country, and so their population is quite different from the rest of the country. Again, this is one of those parts of our system that's arisen through history and is very difficult to change. The other part of your question, and maybe this brings us to our next topic of discussion, one of our issues we want to talk about is which states are most important. So because of the Electoral College and the map, just as you describe it, if a state is very strongly Republican or very strongly Democratic, there's no reason to campaign there because each party knows who is going to win, and the president or the presidential nominee of the opposition party don't spend any time in the states that are safe states, the states that we know who the winner is going to be. So most of the campaigning, if you've been watching it, by the two presidential candidates is just in about 8 states, the so-called swing states, the states that could go either way in the election. And so they get lots of advertisements, lots of visits by the presidents and the vice presidential nominees, and that's where all the media are focused. And other states are almost forgotten in this process.
So since we switched to the jumped over the question, maybe I'll give you. Do you have any comments? Okay, on this one about the states.
A small question about the swing states. You know, they probably are the point of most interest to all the candidates. I mean, to both of them. Yep. But according to the list I have here, none of them, I mean, neither Romney nor Obama have actually visited North Carolina in October at all. I mean, nothing, absolutely nothing. Not a single rally, although the state has 15 electoral votes, which is, I mean, considerable. How could you explain that to a person that basically, I mean, is there any answer or explanation to that?
So this is a strategic decision. If you look at the close swing states, for the last several months and still now, Obama has a small edge in some of the critical swing states, Ohio in particular. Ohio is the state where there's the most attention to focus of any state. And I think the Obama team, this hasn't been written in the media, but this is my guess of what they're thinking, is they can afford to lose North Carolina and still win the election in many different ways with different combinations of states. Romney cannot afford to lose North Carolina. He really can't afford to lose Ohio. Obama can win even without North Carolina, even without Florida. So they're trying to pick the states that will really lock in 270 electoral votes for them. And so they just decided North Carolina was going to be difficult. They could have been competitive there, but they decided to put their money and their effort and their advertisements and their presidential visits in some of the other states. So the way it is right now, Romney has to win in almost all of the close states to get to 270 electoral votes, and Obama can afford to lose some of those and still get to 270. And this is why, if you look at the websites that try to calculate the odds, like Nate Silver's website that I mentioned, they put the odds right now at about 70% likely that Obama would win and about 30% likely that Romney would win. But, 30% is a pretty big possibility as well.
Thank you.
Since we jumped over to my question, maybe I'll jump to your question. Yes. And we know that
certainly
during the election campaign, financing is very important. And so I don't know whether we really know much about it, because a lot of information is confidential, and I think so. Or maybe not. Maybe all the finance is open in the United States. and in Russia. So what can you say and you say about both of us? And how can we comment on the finance problem in the election campaigns? And then the second one about internet, but it's kind of different one. They're not really connected closely. So first maybe financing, then information campaign or internet, anything. Can you say, should we say something or should you? I don't know now. Who will start? Do you have anything to say here at the table?
So maybe I could address
Maybe
the
you
question
could,
there, and there
yeah.
might be some
Yeah.
other questions then.
Sure.
So this is by far the most expensive campaign in American history. Both Romney and Obama have raised and almost spent close to $900 million each person. And then there are the so-called PACs, political action committees, that are outside of the campaigns and raise their own money separately from the campaigns. And this, one of the reasons this is the most expensive election ever is because of a ruling by the Supreme Court. Outside groups can raise money and spend it as long as they're independent of the campaigns without revealing all of the donors to those groups. So this is a new development. Most of the donations directly to the campaigns, to the parties, have to be open and transparent, and you can read about who donates what. But these outside committees now can get a lot of money, and so we have an unprecedented amount of money that comes from a small number of very wealthy Americans on both sides of this election campaign. And so the advertisements, I don't know if any of you are in these states where there are a lot of these advertisements, but they're just relentless. They're on the news, they're on the radio, they're on the TV all the time because these campaigns are just spending a huge amount of money, and that's where a lot of the money is going right now.
Any other comments here? Maybe then I can say that you see what surprises me that when I watched the conventions, the Democratic and Republican conventions, it was like a play, actually, a show, and so much money spent. Do Americans, as we say, taxpayers, ask questions about the expenses during the election campaigns, or they are quite satisfied with the how the money are actually used, and they like the show and they like the campaign, and they, for instance, don't say that while the United States has problems with the budget, with the in general economic problems, there's so much money spent on the election advertisements and actually trips and all kinds of things. So I'm just curious whether it is really the question that is discussed or it is just not discussed.
Maybe some of our students want to comment on the financing and the conventions?
Well,
No?
I think that just in particular among young people here, it's the amount of money spent on these campaigns is a cause of concern, especially with the state of the economy in the U.S. right now. Jobs are a hard thing to find, and the fact that we have politicians spending so much money on the campaigns is frustrating, I think, to many people.
Anything we can say on that, on the finance? Internet, how do we see the role of internet during, how do you see actually Americans, your young generation, whether you follow the electronic devices just when you have the elections? Because here in Russia we have it at night, and actually it's very hard for us to follow because we otherwise we don't sleep at night, but still we follow that and we try to get the news from all possible sources. How is it work? Does it work in the United States?
Yes. Have you all been getting the same emails that I get? Can you say something about that? What kind of emails are you getting on the election? I'm getting emails all the time. I signed up, I donated some money 4 years ago, and I get 5 emails a day from Michelle Obama and from Barack Obama. And so they're using it very aggressively to reach out to everybody on their list. They're using it to get out the vote. They're using it to get money. They're also the other effect is whenever something happens on the campaign, whether it's Romney saying that statement at a fundraiser about 47% of Americans, or Obama saying something 4 years ago about Americans clinging to their guns and religion, that gets played on YouTube endlessly. So anytime a politician makes a mistake, they don't know they're being recorded, or they say something inappropriate, it gets played over and over, and so it's kind of free advertising for the other campaign. And then sometimes they use it in their own campaign ads as well. They'll take that video clip and they'll put it into an advertisement. So I've been, as I said, I've been watching and participating in this for 20 or 30 years, and there's been a steady increase in how continuous all this coverage is. When I started in the 1980s, if a candidate said something at a high school in Iowa, it wouldn't get necessarily reported, and now anything they say anywhere can end up in an advertisement on YouTube, anything. And so one of the reasons they are so careful and scripted most of the time is they're very aware that they're always, one microphone away from a damaging statement. So it's really changed the nature of the whole dynamic in the time that I've been watching it.
Thank you, Andrew. Maybe just you will continue then with these questions about partisan.
Yes. So one issue a lot of Americans are concerned about is the increasingly partisan nature of our politics. And there are a number of historical reasons for that. But maybe some of your students have questions about, the parties, or why it's become this way.
Okay.
Yes. Hello. My name is Anastasia, and I have a question. It is that, do you think that the two most popular parties that exist right now, do they satisfy the needs of your country? And if not, is it easy to create another party? And, well, is it easy for it to become popular? What is the mechanism of creating a party in America? I don't know that.
Maybe some of you could comment on whether the parties appeal broadly as they used to.
I guess nowadays most states already have a side whether or not they're Democratic or Republican already. So regardless of, even though Democratic, it's not like everyone's vote counts as towards who gets voted or who gets elected. It's more like where you live that really matters. For example, I'm from New York, and New York is well known as a widely Democratic state. So even if I say I vote Republican, it wouldn't really matter towards in the big run, because New York is probably just going to vote for Obama. And regarding the states, the third parties, we know they exist, but most people don't really pay them any mind, because we were talking about how there's a lot of funding that's going towards these campaigns, and these third parties are much, much smaller than the Democratic and Republican parties, and so they don't have as much financing and funding, so they can't really advertise or do any campaigning really. So they're on the ballot, but we don't really know much about them, really.
One thing that political scientists have studied about parties is that when you have a winner-take-all system like we do in the United States, then you tend to get only two very centrist parties. because there's, as you said, there's no payoff, there's no incentive for a third party. If you get 30 or 40% of the vote, you could still get 0% of the seats, right? Whereas in the many European systems where there's proportional representation, then there is an incentive for third parties, because if you get 30% of the vote, you get 30% of the seats in the parliament. So here, for a lot of reasons, there are many disincentives to a third party becoming important. It's hard to organize, it's hard to raise money, it's hard to get votes, it's difficult to get on the ballot in all 50 states. At the same time, sometimes small party candidates can make a big difference. Ralph Nader, who's not very well known, was a consumer advocate. He was on the ballot in 2000, and he won enough votes in Florida that it made the difference between Gore and Bush. Ross Perot ran back in 1992 and got almost 20% of the vote. So in a very close election, even a small party that has no chance of getting president can still make a difference to the outcome. But there was an effort this year to create a third party. There was a group that put up, I think it was $20 million of campaign money, and said, here's this money ready. If we can get a serious candidate, we'll give this money to them to the campaign. And they had difficulty getting any well-known politicians to take that offer, because none of the existing politicians in the two parties wanted to ruin their reputation in their party by trying to create a third party. So it has happened in distant American history, the Whigs and other parties. It hasn't happened in a long time. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult for any third party to have a lasting impact or a real chance at winning the presidency, or even a seat in the Senate. Or we have had sometimes third parties win governorships, or there are some independents in the Senate, but it's very difficult.
Okay. Any comments? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a question, and as you said, probably if you are a Democrat living in a Republican state or the other way around, your vote doesn't really count. May you go to some other state to vote there, just that your vote could count?
I'm not sure, but I think there's, like, if you move to another state, or if you move to another district, you have to live there for a certain amount of period, like I think at least 6 months something, and then so you have to move way before the election in order for your vote to count, and you need to then register and everything.
Yes. Students might be able to, because they move and they study for several years, but apart from that, it's not really a factor for the reasons she just described. You have to live there for quite a while to be able to register to vote in that state.
And could it be an incentive for internal migration? For example, I choose where to work or to live, and does it matter? Will it matter for me not for me, for an American citizen, if a state is Republican or Democratic?
Well, one of the things in our society is increasingly, with the partisanship in politics in Washington, people have started to tend to live around people who have similar political views to theirs. So if you look at the map of the United States and the last election in 2008 or in 2000, and you look where the counties that are Republican or Democratic, if you look at the United States from space at night, and you see where the lights are, where the big cities are, well, the big cities tend to be Democratic, and the countryside tends to be Republican. And so the map of the electoral map of the United States, the counties by their vote in the presidency, is almost the same as the map of cities in the United States. And so the fight is really over the suburbs. Who's going to win the suburbs around the cities? So people increasingly do live around people with similar views to their own, not entirely, but people who choose to live in cities are more cosmopolitan, more liberal generally, more democratic. Even in the southern states like Texas, the cities like Austin, have a lot of Democrats, whereas you get in the countryside, it's much more Republicans. So this is one of the facts of our society, where not just the politics, but society itself, and where people do choose to live. It's not that they're moving so that they can vote, it's just they're moving to be around people who have similar views to theirs about politics, about schools, about religion, about these other things. And so this is why, for example, we talk about the solid South, the South of the United States. Most of those states vote Republican, although, as I said, even the cities in the southern states tend to vote Democratic. But people increasingly do live around people like themselves, and it's a more segregated society in that way than it was 30 years ago.
I do have several friends that prefer to vote in their home states. As their students here, they still prefer to vote in their home states because they think that their vote will actually count there. So while here it may be more democratic based on what you've just described, they would prefer to still vote in Oregon or vote Democratic there because they would have more weight there via the absentee ballot. Sorry, I should skip the mechanism.
One other point about partisanship and why do we see such a partisan divide in the United States. We have a rule in the Senate that you need more than 60 votes. You need 60 votes to stop what we call a filibuster. A filibuster is where somebody just uses up time and prevents things from happening. And so if you take the states in the United States with the smallest population, each state has 2 senators. So in Wyoming, where I grew up, there's a very small population of about 400,000 people. They get 2 senators. In California, there's about 40 million people. They also get 2 senators. Okay? So this overrepresents the states with a small population. So if you ask how many Americans does it take to represent 40 votes in the Senate that can stop things from happening, it only takes about 11% of the population. If you took the smallest states by population, it only takes 11% of Americans to have a veto over anything happening in the U.S. Senate. So this is one reason that the interests of these smaller states, especially on issues like agriculture, are very strongly represented in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress, because they can form a veto bloc if they can just get a small proportion of the population. And this is a very controversial rule in the Senate. It's not part of our Constitution, but it's been a rule that's arisen over time, and it might be difficult to change, but it's not impossible to change. Each party talks about changing this rule of the rule of the cloture vote, it's called, this rule that you need 60 votes. But they're always a little bit afraid to do it, even when they're in the majority, because they think that that will create a lot of opposition from the minority party. Now, in the Senate this time, it's likely that the Democrats will continue to hold the majority, but it's very unlikely they would get more than 60 votes in the Senate. And so this will continue to be a problem. Whoever is president, this will continue to be a problem. It's very difficult to get 60, 61 votes in the U.S. Senate.
Okay. Yeah, we're a little bit behind our time, so a lot of interest to these issues, and now we're coming to one of the most, I think, exciting. It is about the debates during American elections, when there are debates between the candidates. And do we have anything to say about that? Whether they're really important, these debates? Do we believe to what they're saying, or do Americans believe to what they're saying to them? Do they believe to their promises, or it is just also a show, part of the election campaign, like a big show? I'm curious about that. Can you say anything, or American?
I think the debates are incredibly important for several reasons. First of all, there were 3 debates happening, 3 presidential debates that happened in this campaign. And as you kind of look at the progression, you can see how the candidates view particular issues and how the candidates change their rhetoric as you progress through the debates. So for one thing, for me, I could see whether or not they stick to their guns and actually believe in a particular issue and will have an actual concrete stance on it, or if they will change it based on their ratings. So that's one thing. The other thing that's really important for me is how they handle the pressure. If you are a country leader and you cannot handle the pressure of being in front of the entire country, or being in front of the entire international community, answering really hard questions, I would not want you to be my leader. I would not want that person to be representing my country. The way that a particular candidate would speak in a under pressure situation is incredibly important also foreign policy wise, because when you go up and you have meetings with foreign, international leaders or national dignitaries, the way you frame a certain issue is incredibly important, and it essentially can lay out the rest of the diplomacy course. And for me, the debates represented how each candidate would frame that particular, whatever your issue is, would frame that issue in an international dialogue. And so I could, from their point on, I could make my choice in terms of, do I want that person to be representing my country? Do I want that person to be representing my country on domestic issues? And do I want that person to be representing my country on international issues? So while it is still a show, and there's a certain element of acting and there's a certain element of performance, I think it reflects a much deeper political foundations and much deeper leadership qualities.
Anything you want to say here?
Can I just ask a very quick question? Now, is it true that no American, or almost no American, chooses a president on the basis of foreign policy? So, how would you compare the domestic debate and the debate on foreign policy? Which one's more important?
Yes, so the importance of foreign policy is different in different election years. During the Vietnam War, of course, it was important. It was important in 2008 when we had the wars going on in both Iraq and Afghanistan. You're correct that this time there's less attention to foreign policy, and we see the first debate had about 70 million Americans watching it, which is quite a high number. By the third debate, partly it's because it came third, but partly because it was foreign policy, it was only about 60 million people were watching it. So there is there is clearly less interest, and when you look at pollsters ask the question, what's the most important issue to you, and foreign policy is very far down the list this time. On the other hand, what they're watching for, as you just described, is they're watching for how does this person handle themselves under pressure? Do they understand foreign policy issues? It's kind of what we call a litmus test for leadership. If you can't show at least enough credibility, or if you can't manage a crisis, then it's very hard to look presidential and for people to imagine you being president, hard to vote for being president. Sometimes the crisis isn't foreign policy. Clinton in 1992, he had a crisis where there was a woman who had worked in the state of Arkansas, under him as governor, and she said he had a relationship with her that was inappropriate. Well, he managed to address that crisis in his campaign. It was a campaign crisis, and he addressed that. He won the nomination, but people sort of saw that this guy can handle a crisis, and even if it wasn't foreign policy, it sort of gave him more credibility that he could make decisions under pressure, where some other candidates would have failed at that task. In fact, some had. So that's what they're looking for, and even if they're not focused on the foreign policy issues, you still have to be credible enough on those issues. And I think most of the people commenting on the debates felt that Romney at least passed the bar, that he showed he understood the issues, and he seemed that he could handle himself under pressure, and so he wasn't sort of disqualified among the voters by that debate, even if most observers thought Obama did better in that debate. Of course, it's easier to do better when you're already president, you've already made crisis decisions. You don't have to convince people that you're credible on foreign policy. So that debate was more important to Romney than it was to Obama, and Romney at least did the minimum of what he had to do in that debate.
Thank you.
Since we touched upon the international issues, I would like to have a quick answer, maybe question and quick answer. One of the participants mentioned that she likes the way they handle the questions, the reaction. So Obama, the President Obama, when he was the candidate last time, 4 years ago, he handled very well all the war questions about the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and anything, and promised peace, as I remember. So, and now we can see that he was not the peace president. He didn't bring a lot of peace to many countries. But still, what do you think, how he handles the question of international engagement of the United States this time? Are you satisfied with the way he handles and Romney handles this war and peace issue?
I'm sorry, is this a question personally to me?
Maybe to you, just to everybody.
Sure.
No, because we are speaking about the debates and we like how they handle, but actually Obama is already the second time he promises. For Mitt Romney is the first time that he makes promises. Right. So maybe just you can say something about that.
Absolutely. I think in both times he's handled it well, and while I do agree with you that he's faced certain obstacles about for bringing those promises to the reality and actually fulfilling them in terms of peace in particular countries, and he certainly faced crises in other countries like Syria, Libya, whatever you would like to, whatever point in the Middle East you'd like to point. But at the same time, from my understanding of his foreign policy, he has made an emphasis on international engagement, and he's fulfilled that as much as he could, considering Republican Congress, considering other constraints, considering other international constraints as well as domestic constraints. And I do think that he has handled, in the current debate, that he has handled the questions really well. In fact, I think his foreign policy stance was somewhat mirrored by Romney's rhetoric. So to me that points to the fact that Romney which differs from Romney's previous statements, to me that points to the fact that Romney either does not know what he's talking about and he's simply agreeing with the current course, but in contrast to Obama he really did make an effort for international engagement, and in diplomacy, in my understanding, if things are quiet and international engagement is happening quietly, diplomacy is working. It's only when things go wrong and the crisis emerges that's when you could point to those particular times and say that the international engagement has failed. So judging from his record of the previous 4 years, those crises have been rare enough, and there has been enough effort on international engagement that I think he has fulfilled on those statements, and I personally believe that he will fulfill on his current statements on peaceful relations with whatever countries.
Thank you.
My personal opinion.
Andrew, your question then about Democrats, should we majority?
Yes, so we've talked a lot about the presidential election, but of course this is also a House election. It's also election for the Senate. 1/3 of the seats in the Senate are up every 2 years. So one issue is whether that will change. I suggested already that it's unlikely that the Democrats will lose the Senate, but they could. There are 8 very close Senate races right now that could go either way. It could be a late night of watching the election before we know who has control of the Senate. But most observers don't expect the House to change parties. The Republicans have a pretty big majority in the House right now, and it's unlikely that this election will change the leadership of the House. So what's probably going to happen is no matter who wins the presidency, they're going to face a Congress that's divided between the House and the Senate, there's some possibility it could be, if Romney were to win and the Republicans win the Senate, we could have the House, the Senate, and the White House all in the same party, but I think that's unlikely. So the first issue after the election in domestic politics is going to be this issue we call the fiscal cliff, where there's the Congress has already voted very sharp spending cuts across all of the federal government, including the defense budget and the social services budget. And nobody really wants those sharp cuts and those rises in taxes to happen, but the two parties haven't been able to agree on what to do about it, and they're going to have a short window after the election to try to reach some kind of agreement on that. And again, depending on who wins, if Obama loses, he'll still be president until February. He may try to still cut a deal, although it would be very difficult as an outgoing president. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now in the U.S. economy because of this issue, not knowing not just the presidency, but the House, the Senate, and how the politicians are going to deal with this fiscal cliff problem. But maybe, Tatiana, we're running a little behind. Maybe we should move on to the question of U.S.-Russian relations after the election.
Yeah, just so what can you say, just please? Do you have any ideas about the future of our relations? How do you estimate them now? Or just any speculations, any ideas?
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, first, kind of a loaded question. Who would you guys like to win?
Who? Who do you prefer?
Well, I prefer Obama, as I've already said, and I believe most Russians would agree, but still, I personally believe it wouldn't change much. Just that, as we probably see and as we have seen throughout the history, foreign policies are not driven just by the main figures, but by some interests of states. So even if Obama loses foreign policy, maybe the discourse would be harsher, but foreign policy wouldn't change much anyway. That's what I think.
Can I just say, and now I completely, or not completely, I partly agree with my colleague saying that it wouldn't probably change that much in the bilateral relations, but I think that what it would change is the tone, the syntax, and the rhetoric between the two states at the highest level. And given the amount of cooperation going on these days between the two countries, which is not much, but I mean, we have to be honest. And if it weren't for the nuclear weapons and disarmament, there probably wouldn't be going that much at all. So I think at times like this, the bilateral relations are mostly confined to rhetoric and speaking and talking to each other. And by the way, that was the only thing the reset was about, to change the rhetoric. So I think if Mr. Romney comes to be the next president, then those famous quotations like Russia is America's #1 geopolitical foe, it does mean a lot to us. So I think I would join my colleagues saying that I would vote for Obama.
We should give you citizenship.
You should, you definitely should.
And I also would like to mention the fact that although Mitt Romney had told that he regarded Russia as #1 geopolitical ally, still during the last enemy during the last debates, Russia hasn't been mentioned at all. So relations with China was regarded of strategic importance, and the situation in the Middle East and related problems, but relations with Russia were not considered at all. That is also the sign about the priorities and about the relationship, the cooperation.
Yes. So I'm personally, even though I'm also an Obama supporter, I'm a little bit more optimistic about what would happen in U.S.-Russian relations if Romney were president. You know, candidates say things on the campaign trail to try to win votes. The senior President Bush very famously had a conversation with Gorbachev in the limousine before the American election, and he said to Gorbachev, "Don't pay too much attention to what I say on the campaign trail. That's really just politics. And then after I win, then we'll talk business." You know. then we'll talk about the relationship in a serious way. So this very strange comment by Romney about Russia being a geopolitical foe, of course that's going to get a lot of attention. But if you look closely at the Romney campaign and the advisors, there are two groups of people here. There are some neoconservatives that were people that were prominent in the second Bush administration, people like John Bolton, who was then our ambassador to the United Nations, very conservative, very neoconservative, very aggressive. And then there are other people like Robert Zoellick, who'd also been in the Bush administration, but much more moderate figure, and later was head of the World Bank. And these two groups are arguing within the Romney campaign, and sometimes he says something that seems to represent one group, and sometimes he says something that represents the other. But if you look at the debate on foreign policy, it was clearly the more centrist, pragmatic ideas that he was saying. Now, partly he's saying that to get elected, moving to the center. This is a standard tactic in American politics. When you run for the primary, you run to the left in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party, you run to the right in the Republican Party. After you get the nomination, you try to get back to the center. And actually, Romney's been a little bit slow to get back to the center, but he has in these three debates. That's what he's been trying to do. So, you know, it's still uncertain which of those groups would be prominent if he were to be elected. You would watch to see which individuals go into which positions. But I think any president is going to have to deal with the reality that we need Russia's cooperation on Afghanistan to get supplies there, since it's so difficult to do that through Pakistan. We need Russia's cooperation on arms control. We need Russia's cooperation on Syria through the UN Security Council. And so there are many issues where I think our common interests outweigh our differences. And if one can set aside some of the rhetoric that Romney has been saying on the campaign trail, I suspect you'd see it would be a more difficult policy. It would be a more difficult relationship than the Obama administration. But I think even Romney and his advisors would have to recognize that there are many things that are going to work better in the world if the U.S. and Russia are working together.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. Very quickly, we have just 1 minute. Okay? Okay.
Hello, I have a question. So thank you for you, Andrew, respecting and appreciating our relations. And generally, how much do Americans really care about the relations between Russia and the USA? And how much do they appreciate if Mr. Obama or Mr. Romney did say or didn't say anything about the relations between our countries during the debates, for example, their campaigns? Thank you.
Yes, we couldn't hear the second half of your question, but I would say a lot of the American public isn't paying much attention to Russia right now. As we said earlier, they're not paying much attention to foreign policy in general, and they're mostly focused on the issues that affect the U.S. economy, including international trade. So I don't think Romney's comment about Russia being a foe, I don't think that's something that the American people generally think. I know when the public does pay attention, they don't understand why Russia has not done something more tough about Assad in Syria. That's sort of hurting Russia's reputation with the public, but I think the public doesn't look negatively towards Russia in general, the way that Romney's comment might suggest.
Okay, so I think we've run out of time with our discussion, but we have several questions from the internet. And maybe I'll just read the questions. The first one is, to me, is very important. How accurate are the polls that give us the information about the distribution of supporters of the candidates? What can you say about the polls?
Yes. So we have more polls than we've ever had before. This has continued to grow each election. And what you really need to pay attention to are the state polls, because as we said earlier, it's really 50 state elections. It's not really a national election for the presidency because of the Electoral College. So there are a lot of different state polls. They don't always agree, and most of these polls are done with a sample of 500 to 1,000 voters. The bigger the sample, the smaller the margin of error for the poll. But most of the polls have a margin of error of around 3%. Now, if you look at some of the key swing states, the difference between Romney and Obama is less than 3%. So that's when we say it's within the margin of error. So that's what makes it so interesting that these polls are so close in these key swing states. But the other issue is if they're close in a lot of states, as they are, and if, as I said, Romney has to win most of those close states, then even if the sum of the polls are not accurate, it still suggests that the odds right now are that Obama would be reelected. But it's very difficult to predict, and it still could go either way this election.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. And another question, how does the media portray candidates? For example, they focused on Ryan's physical fitness activities. So we have the same president. Our President Putin is also just very often seen as a very physically strong man, very fond of sports and everything. Now, whether really it is so important in the media to see such things, huh? Because
yes, I think Joe Biden is jealous that he doesn't get any attention for his physique. But there are certain issues that get a strange amount of attention, and that's certainly one of them. When I mentioned because of the internet, because of YouTube, some of these things, there have been more. There were more hits on the photo of Ryan without his shirt on than there were of Ryan and foreign policy. So there are these distractions or amusements that happen. There were certainly plenty of those in the primary campaign on the Republican side. Lots of funny and interesting things happened there. But now people are getting serious. It's 2 weeks before the election. It's been a long process, more than a year, as I said. And now voters are tuning in. There are a very small percentage of voters that are still undecided, and both the campaigns are trying very hard to win their vote. So people are taking their responsibility seriously, and even though there's lots of distractions in the media, people are talking to their neighbors and their families and their friends and thinking about how they're going to vote.
And so there's a question. Want to say something? We have the question connected with this kind of sports ideas. Do you think that bringing celebrities like Hollywood stars into the campaigns helps candidates to gain popularity amongst younger voters? So when, for instance, we had the same in our 1996 campaign when President Yeltsin was dancing, and so is it really so important for young voters in the United States to see their presidents with the celebrities surrounded with the Hollywood stars?
Maybe you all could say something about that?
I don't personally take that into too much account when I'm looking at who I'm going to vote for to be the next president, and I don't see that most people look to that. I think they base their opinions more off of what they hear their candidates say, and I think for the most part what I hear is about Hollywood kind of being like a liberal bubble in the sense that they usually support the Democratic candidate, so I don't know that it has too much of effect about the individuals supporting the candidates. Like, for example, Beyonce recently was at the White House supporting Obama, but I don't think that changed many people's opinions about Obama or Romney.
And we have maybe the last question that is connected with the young generation. Is there a unified youth mobilization effort in the U.S.? What motivates young voters in the United States and in Russia maybe also, I don't know. The younger people there, what motivates you? What does motivate your choice?
Our choice, or when you're talking about mobilization in terms of more social kind of...
The question sounds like a unified youth mobilization effort. Yeah, okay, mobilization effort.
I'm not a part of one necessarily to really answer that question, but I can, from my friends, from what I've heard from my friends, it's a particular personal issue that would involve them in a particular campaign. So for some of my friends, it could be their stance on abortion. For other of my friends, it could be their stance on even foreign policy. in Washington, D.C., foreign policy does tend to be a big factor in the election. But so it's personal kind of an issue that they want to see, or LGBT rights, the rights of homosexuals, lesbians, transsexuals, transgender rather. So it could be whatever their stance is on a particular issue, that they would like to see that issue represented at a national level, and that's how they get involved in campaigns and in the larger social mobilization movements. As much as that.
Anything to say here? Nobody?
Well,
okay, louder.
I have one more question, just a small question. We have seen a very strong advocacy of early vote on the part of Mr. Obama lately. Do you think it will really matter if people will cast their votes earlier?
Yes, well, this has been interesting. There have been efforts on both sides either to get out their own vote or to suppress the vote on the other side. The Republicans in many states have tried to raise the standards of what kind of identity you have to show at the voting booth to try to help their side, because they think that's more difficult for Democrats. Whereas Obama has put a lot into his effort, we call it the ground game, of really having lots of people, especially in Ohio and other states, that know exactly where all their supporters are, and then make sure that they all get out to the vote, that they can get a ride to the vote if they need one. And most people think that the Obama campaign has a stronger effort here on the ground to get out those votes in those last few days. So that one reason that they're trying to get out people early is if they get people out to vote early for their side, then they can take them off the list and they can concentrate their efforts on the people who haven't voted yet. And so this is part of their very organized campaign to identify all their voters and make sure all of their voters get out to vote. And Obama was better at this 4 years ago than McCain was. He's kept all of those email lists. I keep getting all the emails myself. So this is one factor. When you look at the question of the accuracy of the polls are trying to figure out where the likely voters are going to vote, because your opinion doesn't matter if you're not going to vote. And so there's some uncertainty here. Will Obama do better than the polls because he's got a really good turnout effort? Or will he do worse than the polls because maybe the polls overrepresent some of his constituencies just because of the way the polls are done? And so this is a little bit uncertain too, and one of the things that makes it a little bit difficult to predict the election.
So we have representatives of mass media here. Maybe there are questions from the mass media pool. If you would like to, you can just hear. No questions from journalists, from mass media. Everything is clear for them. Yeah, they don't have questions.
I have a question, if you wouldn't mind.
Great.
If we could go back to the U.S.-Russia relations, what is your stance on the several of recent Russian initiatives, such as expulsion of USAID and some of the recent NGO laws? And also, what would you like to see Russia do to improve the relations between the United States and Russia?
Okay.
So there's two questions that I'm asking.
Great question.
Who can answer? You can. Yes, try.
Shall I try? I think for the first part of the question, the USAID, NGOs, not being a member of any of those, I personally didn't care about that very much. But I think the general sentiment here in Russia is that we all like and support the idea of, non-interference in domestic affairs and so on. So many people, although it's not true that USAID was trying to, support the opposition or something else, or change the power in Kremlin, they were feeling like those organizations they were contributing to certain direction, political direction of domestic policy here in Russia, and they probably would oppose that. But I think there is nothing tragical about that. social dialogue and human exchange and cultural exchange can go on even without the US aid and stuff. I'm just wondering if any of my colleagues have different opinion on that.
Any ideas about the NGO and USAID? To me, it's a very complicated question, because in order to speak on the subject really well, you need to know all the details about the activities of the organizations. So you need to know, to analyze what they have been doing, all the activities and etc. It might be the question for a separate discussion. But speaking about the USAID, I think they have worked here almost 20 years, and I think now is the time for the Russian government to finance the scholars and the young people, giving them grants for research. So I think it's time for Russia itself to start supporting its citizens, its students, and representatives of the academic community. But still, it's a separate question, to me at least. As an analyst, I cannot just speak just like that, know nothing about the real activities of every NGO in Russia. But we have one more question from the internet. So what is the attitude towards current political situation in Russia in the United States? Is there any attitude? How do you estimate the Russian political situation? How do you estimate, or American colleagues estimate? Any ideas about our political situation?
Sure, I can speak to that.
Good.
The honest answer is that it concerns me. The series of laws that have been passed, including the NGO law, maybe USAID issue aside, but including the NGO law, including the blacklisting of particular internet sites, including an LGBT law in St. Petersburg that has been recently enacted, and including the high treason law that is currently going on through the Duma, and recriminalization of libel, and et cetera, that personally concerns me, because to me it seems that all of these laws, as they're written now, are so vaguely written that they could be used to not only fulfill their explicit goals, but also to go after the opposition and restrict democratic processes and restrict the civil society. And to go back to the USAID issue, while I certainly agree with you, you should understand really details of particular activities of particular NGOs to make a judgment. From what I know about USAID, it's the emphasis of its programs was rather growth of civil society, and the fact that the civil society now will be restricted in funding worries me, because it will not be able to put out these activities, whether they're political or whether they are more humanitarian in nature, such as disability rights, such as some cultural or health issue. So the recent string of laws and the recent activities really do concern me personally, and to me signal a direction that is negative in Russian political situation.
Okay, thank you very much. Any comments on our side? No comments. Unfortunately, we don't have time left, and it's to me it's a very serious question, the one that was raised, the last one, and still it is a separate question, and it should be analyzed in deep details, because we have different sources of information, various sources of information.
Absolutely.
But maybe next time we'll have a special talk with you and with your students on this subject. But what I would like to say, we are very grateful to you that you told us a lot about your electoral system, about the situation with the elections this year. To me, at least to me, it was highly interesting and highlighted a lot of things. I think maybe you can say something about also. We appreciate very much your desire to talk and to participate in this event. And I think such sincere talks will help to make our relations better. If we consider them to have problems, we will be more open and friendly and understanding each other. Thank you very much. Maybe Andrew, you will also say something for final remarks.
Yes, I would also like to thank Tatiana and all the students at MGIMO. I hope there will be another event. Tatiana mentioned maybe after the American election we can see how things have changed then. That would be very interesting for me as well. So it's been very much a pleasure, and as you said, I hope this does help promote understanding between our two countries. There can be many issues that become difficult, but I hope we can keep our focus on the things that where we have common interests. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased you